A woman named Margaret Bellum is playing hide-and-seek with her daughters. She hears their voices, but can't see them. Suddenly, she hears heavy coughing, and the calm scene shifts into a dust storm. Struggling to find her daughters, she starts choking on the dust, and then she wakes up. It just turns out to be a bad dream. Margaret goes to her daughter's locked room and opens the door. Inside, she finds Rose and little Ollie, who is mute, are sleeping. She carefully checks to make sure they are breathing and sighs with relief. Their home is on a lonely, empty piece of land, and Margaret's husband, Henry, has recently left to look for work. During dinner, Margaret prays for many things, like Henry's safe return and the health of her daughters. She handles everything on her own, which is a heavy and stressful responsibility. While milking their only cow, she asks Rose to bring a small amount of hay, reminding her they need to make it last. As she bathes the girls, their close bond is clear. However, nearby is a grave for another daughter, Ada, who died due to illness. Margaret stuffs fabric under all the windows to block the dust from coming inside. After putting the girls to bed, she reminds Rose to lock the door. Rose then reads a scary story to Ollie called The Gray Man. The story is about an evil spirit that can turn into dust, sleeping in the cracks. Once someone breathes him in, he'll make you do terrible things. A scared Ollie signs that their mom was possessed by the Gray Man. But Rose explains that Margaret was just upset about Ada and wasn't sleeping well, hinting at some past issues. In her room, Margaret remembers a conversation with Henry about leaving with him. Margaret refused because she didn't want to risk the girls on a dangerous journey or leave Ada's grave behind. Margaret takes a sleeping pill, but the same nightmare haunts her. The next day, while walking down the road, they pass children playing near a dead horse's dried-up carcass, wearing creepy goggles and masks. They visit Margaret's cousin, Esther, and her children, Jacob and Thomas. Margaret quietly notices that Esther doesn't clean the dust in her house. Thomas, meanwhile, has a severe, ongoing cough caused by dust pneumonia. Margaret keeps cleaning and sweeping, but as she tells Esther, it's a battle against the endless dust. The next day, they walk to church, and while sitting in the sewing circle, the town gossips, Bertha and Bertie, share the latest news. They talk about a faith healer in the area and a dangerous drifter who robbed and killed a family before vanishing. Later, Margaret tries to convince Esther not to leave with her family, knowing how risky it is. But Esther is desperate to find help for Thomas. Margaret and the girls then rush home to beat an approaching dust storm. They quickly seal up the house and barn. The dust is so thick, they use a rope tied to the house to avoid getting lost. Ollie thinks she sees a man near the house and hides in a closet. Ollie tells Margaret about the man she saw, so Margaret goes outside to check, but finds nothing. She then scolds Rose for scaring Ollie with the Gray Man story. To comfort them, she talks about the wheat field from the past, where they played hide-and-seek when Ada was still alive. The next morning, Rose wakes Margaret, saying someone is outside. Margaret goes to check and finds the barn door open with blood on it. She thinks she sees a person, but realizes it's Esther's horse. As she returns the horse to Esther, she runs into the sheriff. Sheriff and some locals find Esther's cart overturned, with Jacob dead nearby. Esther is buried under the dust next to him, and they think she's dead too, until she coughs. They take Esther back to her house, where the sewing circle ladies urge her to trust in God's plan. But Margaret disagrees, saying they can't rely on God alone. She scolds Esther for leaving during a storm and not keeping her house clean. As they bury Jacob, Thomas's constant coughing fills the air, clearly bothering Margaret. Margaret takes her daughters to the doctor, and although he says they're fine, Rose has started getting nosebleeds like Ada had. Margaret fears Rose might be dying too. The doctor can only give them masks and advise sealing the house. Margaret stuffs fabric into every crack, but the dust keeps coming in. She moves the girls' bed to her room, but Rose worries about what will happen if Margaret stops sleeping again. Margaret reassures her, saying they'll take the train to meet Henry once he sends money. At the next sewing circle, Margaret asks if anyone has gotten their mail. Bertha tells her that the mail is stopped because of dust on the train tracks. Then Margaret asks about the drifter, and Bertha says the sheriff believes it was a made-up story and that the father killed his own family. Back at home, Rose watches Margaret to make sure she's taking her sleeping pills, but she still can't tell if Margaret is getting any sleep. As Margaret continues cleaning, she finds the barn door open with a cow outside. She scolds Rose for not closing the door and Ollie for still talking about the Gray Man. The next time Margaret tries to milk the cow, nothing comes out. She thinks she hears Rose in the loft asking for hay, But when she goes up to check it out, no one is there. Margaret opens the window and sees the girls playing outside. Margaret brings the girls inside and then goes back to the barn with a shotgun. The girls follow her, and suddenly, they feel movement in the floor. A man named Wallace Grady appears from underneath, saying he means no harm. He introduces himself as a man of the cloth and says he's met Henry. Wallace explains that Henry gave him his jacket and asked him to check on Margaret and the girls. Then Rose starts having another nosebleed. Wallace lays hands on her and prays, and surprisingly, the bleeding stops. Wallace offers to help around the house, mentioning that the cow is starving. Later, he helps get the cow to produce milk again by feeding her water-soaked tumbleweeds. Margaret reluctantly agrees to let him stay in the barn to keep him hidden, but she warns him that she will use the gun on him if necessary. The next morning, Margaret wakes up to find it's raining. She goes outside and dances with the girls and sees Wallace doing a praise Jesus move. At the next sewing circle, Margaret adds some rain to the embroidery of her house. Nosy Bertha politely asks why Margaret hasn't been to church. Just then, Rose arrives and asks her to come outside. They come and find Thomas, wearing only his underwear and a mask, wandering around. They visit Esther, who is lying in bed, clearly upset. She rants about the man who's been looking after Thomas, and Margaret notices terrible bed sores on Esther's back. Margaret tells the sheriff that Esther isn't fit to care for Thomas, but admits she can't take him in because they don't have enough food. So, the sheriff takes Thomas, and they leave Esther behind. Upset, Esther runs after them, shouting at Margaret. Later, Margaret asks Wallace how he became a preacher. He says it was partly because of his mother, but his father, who was also a preacher, told him he had the touch young. Margaret opens up to Wallace, telling him that Ollie and Ada both had scarlet fever. She also admits that after Ada's death, she couldn't sleep. Wallace, sensing she's still grieving Ada, tells her there will be a reunion that lasts an eternity. Margaret invites Wallace to dinner, and then, as a surprise, Rose shows her a letter from Henry. Rose reads part of the letter aloud, but Margaret reads the rest. Henry sent blades of grass, which Wallace ties around Ollie's wrist. As Margaret reads in silence, she suddenly signs to Rose, who leaves the room and returns with the gun, but Wallace still holds Ollie on his lap. In the letter, Henry writes that his jacket and money were stolen, and his workmate was murdered by a preacher. Wallace says he wouldn't hurt them, but he demands whatever money they have in the letter. Margaret shoots over his head, and Wallace warns that he can make Rose sick again. Margaret orders him to leave, but before he goes, he burns the letter. He cryptically says that nothing can stop him because he's the gray man, then walks out. That night, Margaret spits out her sleeping pill and keeps watch outside. She has a vision of Ollie talking, but then Esther sneaks up behind her and swings an axe at her head. Margaret screams, but when she wakes, it's morning, and Rose anxiously asks if she's been out there all night. The following night, Margaret piles chairs in front of the door. Suddenly, Rose screams, and Margaret rushes into their room to find the bed on fire. Margaret says it must have been Wallace, but the doors are locked. She then adds he doesn't need doors. He can seep in through the cracks. Rose tries to tell Margaret that the gray man is just a story, but it's clear Margaret is starting to believe it, especially after Wallace healed Rose. Then Esther arrives at the house and apologizes for her earlier behavior. She says everyone's worried about her, so Margaret lets her in. They sew together in the dim kitchen, and Margaret tells Esther she has to keep the cracks sealed. Esther suggests that Margaret needs to get out more and stop overthinking. She invites Margaret and the girls to the church dance. Later, as they get ready for the dance, Rose suggests they tell the sheriff about Wallace. But Margaret says without Henry's letter, there's no proof and no one will believe them. She also fears the sheriff might take the girls away from her, just like he did with Thomas. Then, Rose suddenly yells that she can't breathe. Margaret quickly rips the dress off her, but Rose reassures her, saying she was laughing, not coughing. Margaret then cuts her leg and uses the blood to blush her cheeks, which freak the girls out. At the dance, she thinks she sees Rose talking to the sheriff. The sheriff asks Margaret to dance and casually asks how she's doing. Margaret explains that they've just had a little bug, nothing more. Rose watches her closely, but Margaret doesn't notice that blood is seeping through her dress. Margaret then thinks she sees Esther walking in with Wallace, but it's just the Reverend. Margaret tells Esther that the cut on her leg is making her lightheaded. Esther offers to bring the healer to her, but Margaret notices that Esther is wearing Wallace's cross, realizing it's him under a different name. Margaret begins to tell the sheriff about Wallace, and Rose tries to back her up. But then Margaret starts saying how Wallace can turn into dust, get in through the cracks. They head home, and while Margaret sews Rose's dress, she's so far gone that she doesn't notice she's stitched her hand to the dress. Rose, shocked, cuts her free. They hear loud banging on the door, and Margaret makes sure both girls heard it too. She steps outside with a gun, but the air is thick with haze. Voices seem to surround her, and then she feels someone grab her. She turns quickly and fires at what she believes is Wallace. Rose comes outside, and Margaret explains he disappeared, just like in the book. She screams, urging Rose to get inside. Rose walks through the house, unaware of someone passing by behind her. She enters the bedroom to find Margaret in the corner, scratching at the wall with her nails, tears streaming down her face. When Rose wakes her, Margaret just walks out without a word. Margaret walks to Ada's grave, hearing Rose calling her. But when she turns around, Wallace is there. He approaches her, saying she's sleepwalking and that it's really Rose. Rose pleads with her to wake up, telling Margaret it's not the gray man, but her own actions. She's the one who set the bed on fire and did all the terrible things. Margaret briefly comes back to reality, but she tells Rose that no one can know what's happening. She's trying to protect them, trying to keep them all together. Rose, terrified, tells her she's scaring her as Margaret talks about them being parts of her, even feeling like she's suffocating under the dirt with Ada. Rose runs back inside and locks the door, but Margaret sneaks in through another way. The girls flee outside, with Rose trying to carry Ollie. But Rose trips and stumbles upon Esther's dead body, her face shattered by the shotgun. A dust storm begins, and Margaret takes Ollie back inside. Suddenly, there's more banging at the door. Margaret covers Rose's mouth and knows to stop her from screaming. Ollie opens the door, revealing the sheriff, who they let in. Once in the bedroom, Rose tells the sheriff that Margaret isn't fit. The sheriff checks her gun and sees one shot fired. Margaret explains it was coyotes. He then asks if she's seen Esther, and she says no. The sheriff notices the girls seem shaken and suggests he take them with him. Margaret breaks down in tears, and when the sheriff tries to comfort her, she stabs him. The sheriff stumbles into the hallway and dies, leaving Rose horrified as she picks up the knife. Margaret tells Rose that they'll be hanged for this, so they need to do whatever it takes to stay together. She suggests they just go to sleep and escape it all. Rose approaches Margaret with a knife, and Margaret apologizes for everything. But Rose can't bring herself to kill her. Instead, she asks Margaret to tell them about the wheat field again. While Margaret crushes the rest of her sleeping pills, Rose asks if they can take the medicine with some peaches. Just then, Rose rushes in, panicked, saying that Ollie ran outside into the storm. Margaret ties a rope to the door before heading out into the storm, calling for Ollie. As she disappears into the dust, Rose, holding the bloody knife, cuts the rope and lets it slip away, tears streaming down her face. Margaret feels the rope go slack and stumbles in the swirling dust, choking and coughing, just like in her haunting dream. She sees a vision of the green field and her girls again, all together, before she collapses and suffocates in the dust. Later, Rose and Ollie are seen sitting together in an open boxcar on a train, likely on their way to join their father. As they pass a green field with horses, they smile, but Rose notices the particles of dust in the air, her worry still lingering. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more interesting movie recaps.